Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Patricia Brown, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting this morning session on the changing face of London, part of the Changing Face of London series at the NLA. And today we're going to be looking at the evolution of workplaces. Now, just thinking about this subject before I go on to the fuller introduction, it reminded me of something I did for the NLA City Centre some time ago about the changing face of workplaces. And it reminded me how old I was, because when I first started work, people had ashtrays on their desk, and it's very hard to remember just how far workplaces have changed. And especially, I think a lot of the evolution of our workplaces has actually happened so recently. In the past 20 years, we've seen our work environments, our built environment, our offices in particular, reshaped as, to think about how we provide better places for people, really forged by some incredible creative developers, real estate landlords, and architects and built environment specialists, amongst many of which are amongst the NLA membership. And I'm delighted that we've got a panel of three people, more of which in a moment, that represent that very creative, forward-thinking sector. So the session today is going to be looking back over the along with the changing face of London time frame, looking back over the last decade and a half or so, reflecting on the achievements and lessons learned, but also in line with the NLA's agenda, helping us to look at what the opportunities are for the future. And all of you will have participated and read constantly about the role of workplace in London in light, or across the world, in light of the pandemic. But actually, this is an evolution that has started a long time ago. The initiative, the Changing Face of London initiative, that was celebrating NLA's 15th anniversary. And so today, as I mentioned, we are discussing the transformation of offices in particular during that time of NLA's lifespan. And as I've already mentioned, the pandemic, it's almost a year while we've been working at home, and our lives have changed dramatically. Those of us who can work at home have had the benefit of technology, and we already know that there's going to be a continuing trend to all this. So this is a good moment to pause and reflect and think what we've achieved, what has been done differently, how have we reshaped our workspaces. And I want to explore what we mean by workplaces and workspaces during the Q&A, I would hope. And then, be an opportunity to hear from our three speakers, and then over to you for questions and answers session. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank our programme champions, Atkins, London Communications and GL Hearn, and programme supporters, Argent, Berkeley Group, British Land, Canary Wharf Group, City of London, the Crown Estate, Delancey, Derwent, Peabody, Qatari DR, Quintain and Stanhope. Two of those are actually our speakers. Represent our speakers today. We will be hearing first from Howard Dauber, who's the Managing Director of Strategy for the Canary Wharf Group. We will then be hearing from David Ray, who's Development Director at Stanhope. And last, but as we always say, absolutely not least, Yasmin Ali Annie Spence, who's a Director at Wilkinson Eyre. So now I'd like to introduce Howard to go back over your time in Canary Wharf, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pat, and thanks to NLA for putting on this really interesting and very timely event. I wanted to just start back at the start of Canary Wharf, because there's a couple of things about Canary Wharf that people may or may not know. The first is that obviously we are we're a recycling exercise. We are the regeneration of one of London's original great workspaces, which was the the West India docks, and at its height, 50,000 people worked on the dock. It was effectively created by globalization in the 19th century, early 19th century, and then as a dock destroyed by globalization in the second half of the 20th century. It failed to adapt, and it failed to adapt to change in the way shipping worked and the way trade moved around the world. And in some ways, it couldn't adapt. It wasn't big enough. We don't intend to be in the same position. Canary Wharf, the idea actually came from not the government, who were trying to get light industrial to move into the docks. It didn't come from a developer, although it was the vision of Paul Reichman and Olympia in New York that actually delivered it. The idea for Canary Wharf actually came from a tenant. It came from a guy called Michael von Clem of Credit Suisse, who'd already been through the equivalent of the Big Bang in the United States, where he'd seen the move from office-based to and sort of physical trading through to desk-based, computer-based trading. And he knew that his bank, Credit Suisse, was going to need these big trading floors in London, which it physically couldn't fit at that time into the offices it had in the City of London. So he was desperate for a place where he could build the type of building he wanted for his bank. And it was the end user, the actual occupier, that came up with the idea of Canary Wharf because they couldn't find the space elsewhere. And that's those two things are big lessons to us. First of all, you have to adapt to change, be flexible, anticipate change, drive change if necessary. And secondly, we're only here, all of us who create the built environment, we're only here because people want the space, and because we create the type of space our customers want. So as customers' needs and wants change, we have to adapt to that and provide what they need in the future. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Wood Wharf, which is our expansion on the east side of Canary Wharf. And Wood Wharf, I get into trouble for saying this internally, although it's slightly catching on. If Canary Wharf is like New York, Wood Wharf is like San Francisco. This is designed to be around more creative type businesses, more live-work type space, a more independent type of retail, a more relaxed type of environment than sort of classic Canary Wharf. And it's complementary. Obviously, you've got a diversity of offer on Canary Wharf, but it's also showing a bit of what our future is going to be. I know we're going to get on later to talk about, post-pandemic, will work fundamentally change? I think it already was fundamentally changing. I think the technology change has been the big change over the last 10, 20 years or so. The type of space we create as a workplace now is very different, and the borders between the barriers between recreational space, meeting room, and innovation space, and indeed retail and food and beverage and workspace have been breaking down, and we've got a much wider palette now of types of space that we would create within a building for people. I'll run through this fairly quickly. So if I can have the next slide. Wood Wharf is a big extension. It's not quite as big as King's Cross, but it's pretty big. The reason perhaps you haven't heard much about it is that people expect Canary Wharf to continue to grow in large chunks and don't always come and see it. But Wood Wharf is open, so do come and have a look round. The first residential buildings have been occupied for more than a year now, and the first office buildings, including some of these on the images, are just about to open. So it's designed around lots of open space. So we actually have more open space and public realm on Wood Wharf as a percentage of the ground space than Canary Wharf. So it's about 40% green space and open space. It's got one very large park in the middle of it. The top left picture there is two floating restaurant pavilions, which if you like to watch big bits of civil engineering, they're actually arriving next Friday, a week on Friday, coming into the dock. So two huge floating pavilions coming through into the dock there at Wood Wharf, and that's going to be quite a physical undertaking. And the next slide. Yeah, just please carry on. Yeah, so that's Wood Wharf's there on the the east side of Canary Wharf, and it's deliberately designed with a smaller type of office building. So Canary Wharf, obviously, we really cornered the market at one point in the 1 million square feet office tower, when really it was very difficult to build a building of that size and certainly height elsewhere in London. So when we started Canary Wharf, there wasn't a single 1 million square foot tower in London. Now there are quite a few. Most of them are still at Canary Wharf, but the type of office occupier we're aiming for on Wood Wharf is more of the sort of 100,000 to 200,000 square foot space. It's still pretty big, but obviously much smaller than historic Canary Wharf. The buildings on the bottom half of on the south side of Wood Wharf are residential, and that's a mixture of private for sale and build to rent. So about half, in fact, slightly more than half now, of what we're building is built to rent. The first building there at George Street opened last year. We're running that through our own operation called Virtus, which is a subsidiary set up specifically to manage that built to rent residential and also intermediate social housing. And our first intermediate social housing building is going to open shortly this year as well. We're also going to have full social rent housing, which we're also going to manage, which is going to be interesting. So within Wood Wharf, you'll have fairly big corporate headquarters, space for small, fast-growing tech-type businesses and creative businesses, quite a bit of new retail, but mainly at ground level and mainly independent-type retail. And then all of the tenures you can think of residential, from multi-million-pound penthouses through private sale apartments, build to rent, specifically rented by us, rental apartments, intermediate and full council housing social, all within one environment. So it's going to be quite a new sort of microcosm. I'm running out of time, so what I'm going to do, I'll just show you a couple of pictures of the buildings. You can jump through that. I think everybody knows where we are. Although I should say that Crossrail on this, and I think we're sort of following the Crossrail route in the presentation today. Crossrail is going to be a massive game changer. When it opens, I'm reliably told by the chairman of Crossrail that it will open early next year or possibly earlier, but I'll believe it when I actually get on a train. But Crossrail, when it opens, we'll all wonder how we managed without it. It really is going to change the way people think about London east to west. And it gets you from Canary Wharf to Heathrow in 39 minutes. So that's going to be a big game changer. And I'll tell you what, I'll finish on this. If you haven't been to our Crossrail station, if you haven't visited Crossrail Place at Canary Wharf, we've actually got a light installation on at the moment, which you can visit and still maintain social distancing. But we've got sort of Alice in Wonderland thing in the garden on the roof of Crossrail Place. It is an amazing garden. It's a brilliant building. It's actually, dare I say it, a day out you can do with the kids even during lockdown. I know we're not really supposed to encourage people to do that, but if you've got kids and you're really bored, then come and have a walk around Canary Wharf at night time and see the lights and go through the Crossrail garden, because it is a magical spot. I'll finish there and I'll catch up with other things in the questions, I think.
Thanks very much, Howard. That was absolutely fascinating. And because, what you talked about was this isn't just about workplace, this is about mixed community. And I can testify to how popular that public spaces, especially during your live festivals, year on year, including, although I didn't go there myself during the pandemic, people have been sending me lots of photos. It's a magical place. So now we are actually going to pretend that Crossrail Place is open, and we're going to get on the Crossrail train, and we're going to whisk over to West London and hear from David Ray about Chiswick Park to White City. Over to you, please, David. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Pat. Stanhope, for those of you who don't know, is a developer, and we've got a 30-year history of developing in central London and outer London. And this has included both individual office buildings as well as mixed-use places. So originally Broadgate and then Paternoster Square, and some of the more recent examples I'll cover here, all of which are in West London. So Chiswick Park, White City Place and Television Centre. and they all have quite different characteristics, which I think are quite instructive for this debate. So if you move to the next slide, please. So I've split my talk into 3 parts, starting off by looking at how the demands on London's workplaces from companies and workers have changed over recent years and how they continue to change. Next slide. So firstly, a bit of context. Obviously, we're doing it now, so technology is enabling us to work more flexibly, but this is not just about where we work from. Technology is enabling us to work at different times, less fixed work hours, for good or bad, some may say. It's enabling us to have flexible careers, perhaps portfolio careers, multiple jobs, sometimes even at the same time. We might also identify ourselves less strongly with a single company at a particular time. It's less of a kind of connection between the individual and the corporate entity. And we're more likely to have a varied career with career breaks, work for longer, potentially work part-time. Crucially also, we're likely to have less of a geographical link to company locations, and that's been clearly illustrated the last year. And flexibility too, in terms of the type of buildings that we're working in. So increasingly, and when we're allowed to, again, we'll be potentially working in hotel lobbies, cafes, libraries, as well as homes and offices. Next slide. So cultural change is also a major part of the context of workplace change. There's a number of mega trends here. So as well as the cultural side effects of technology, so for example, I guess the ability to be connected with global contacts and work regularly with people in other parts of the world in a much more connected way, and the blurring of the physical and digital worlds. We're increasingly concerned about climate change and our own personal health and well-being, and we're increasingly part of a very diverse workforce, particularly in London. So these mega trends are also influencing the workplace. They're meaning that people want a social experience at work. They want flexibility and choice about when they work and where they work. They want to, in particular in reference to climate change, they want a connection to their company's brand and a sense of purpose and a belief that what they're doing is worthwhile. Next slide. And it's worth, related to that, touching on the influence of the different generations and the effect that they're having on workplace and office culture. So if you consider Gen Z and Gen Alpha, so broadly those under about 26, next slide. This is some research that we've been doing with the Future Laboratory, but it seems that more than previous generations, there's a prioritization of a sense of purpose in work, and with different attitudes around what is considered to be aspirational in the context of the climate crisis. This potentially will manifest in what is considered to be an aspirational office. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that the highest specification, most opulent or most imposing buildings will be the most desirable and secure the highest rents going forward. Next slide. And here I've set out some thoughts on what that all means for the office itself, or what's less important now than it was, say, 15 years ago, and what is more important. It's a view, but it helps to identify how workplaces may need to change further. So in terms of what's less important, well, we've got an awful lot less stuff, or even no stuff now. Personally, I think I've printed about 3 pages of A4 in the last year, having wanted to go paperless for many years, but this has been the final push. We don't have stationery, really. We don't have photos on our desks, files, mementos. We don't even store our computer data in the office anymore. And online filing, it means that administrative work needn't be done entirely in the office. We now have a web presence for every company, which means our office has a diminished role in setting out company brand and culture. And data security means we can often share spaces with other companies, whereas with hard copy filing, we need more walls and locked doors. However, we do need places to meet and collaborate, to innovate and be creative in teams, and to learn and teach. And arguably, it's more important that we have spaces to attract and recruit talent, to innovate and be creative, and to socialise, because increasingly this reflects where certainly the companies in central London add their superior value, rather than being the office being an administration factory. Next slide. And notably, many of these important functions are more important for younger workers who need to learn and observe. They want to develop personal and work relationships, have formative experiences in person rather than virtually, and want to demonstrate their own capability. But undoubtedly, the combination of rapid technological change and cultural change means seismic change for the office and how we use it and what types of products will be in demand. Next slide, please. So now turning to some recent Stanhope projects and what we've learned in respect to successful workplaces and what we're still learning. Next slide. So this one's Chiswick Park. This is a development of 12 buildings on a 33-acre brownfield site on the western edge of Chiswick in West London. So it's conceived in the late 90s, and the concept at the time was to take the best of both the business park model and then town centre office models as well. Next slide, please. So the buildings themselves were designed with Rogers Stirk Harbour, and they use standardisation to maximise efficiency and quality for a given cost. But perhaps the creation of the Enjoy Work brand for the place was probably most relevant here, because it was a quite progressive approach at the time to actively managing and programming the place. There was an emphasis on, and it still endures as a brand, there was an emphasis on workforce well-being, a range of enlivenment activities. So whether you want to learn the guitar, be part of a sports team here, or take language classes, a real drive to make connections to the community with programs to encourage loyalty to local retailers, support local causes, and have experiences and an events program that all translated into good employee retention. Tenants loved it, and rents achieved a premium versus what was in the local area. So importantly, the approach here borrowed and learned for the hospitality sector, and actually Stanhope recruited director on the project once the first phases were built from the hotel industry. And I think this approach is highly relevant in the immediate future. And you know, many employers are going to have to entice their employees back to work. Some people, certainly in our office, are saving hundreds of pounds a month in travel costs. So they're going to be needed to be persuaded to come back in. And I think learning from the hospitality sector to improve the workplace experience is a key takeaway from this. Next slide, please. So other lessons include, well, Chiswick Park was developed, as I said, it was actually 1999 through to 2015, and in every stage the car parking reduced as the building height increased, and that reflected commuting habits changed, and it's probably likely to be the case that some of the car parking space will actually be developed in the future. And I think if it was conceived now, the urban form would be perhaps more like city centre blocks and promote, while it is a permeable site, it would promote stronger connections to Chiswick High Road's amenities, and there would probably be a greater mix of other uses. Next slide. So moving to White City, we have two projects here. We've got Television Centre, which is on the right in the foreground, and then White City Place on the left. Next slide. White City Place was developed as Media Village from the early 1990s to 2000s as a purely BBC campus. So latterly it was probably managed quite passively. It felt quite tired. It was quite off pitch. It's up next to the A40, but well connected for White City Central Line. And we've worked very hard to enliven the place. And I think there's quite a symbolic and broader theme here that's a good analogy for what might be important to the future success of the workplace. Because what we did was to take the opportunity to supplement one very established, respected brand, the BBC, with a range of new, diverse, creative companies and brands to create a much more vital, exciting place with lots of activity and possibilities. Next slide, please. So the range of occupiers now is broad. There are a whole range of sectors, including life sciences, tech companies, and art, the Royal College of Art. And we've got lab space, so there's a variety of product too. And I guess the possibilities for collaborations between the companies have been made easier through our approach to the place. So we've now made it a more open, sociable, eventful workplace than it was previously. Next slide. So we refurbished and relet the existing buildings over the last 5 years, and we've now started development of 3 new buildings, which will add density and vitality. We've got a cultural partnership with the Royal College of Art, and that's been important to refresh and energise the place through events and installations. Next slide. We have a studio which is very functional, as well as providing an interesting structure in the public realm. And our co-working operator, Huckletree, has been absolutely key to enliven and animate the place through an events programme, through having very open lecture space on the ground floor, and by providing the place with a kind of stronger entrepreneurial spirit by making it easier for SMEs to be based in White City Place. Next slide. We also promote interactions between the buildings through cafes and the lobbies, a theatre space, a central accessible garden with routes through the building to that, and a cafe bar. And we collaborate with Imperial College across the road, which is a key attractor for our life science occupiers. Next slide, please. So getting the ground plane right has been particularly important and challenging, to be honest, in the last year. So the balance of setting an appealing tone for the place versus ensuring that it's affordable for everyone's everyday needs, and aiming to bring life and activity 7 days a week here, when the offices are only used, say, 5 days at best, is a key focus. And I think that's particularly relevant going forward as well. The retail here will be supported by a further 1 million square foot of offices between the 3 buildings we're bringing forward, as well as the development of the Imperial campus across the road and the existing residential around. But it's important that the place feels open and welcoming for everyone 24/7, so that the retail can draw on that demand and so be more resilient. Next slide. And at White City Place, we've built on the kind of Chiswick Park experience and worked very hard on the overall office experience, recognising that the office needs to be a flexible space for social activities, including innovating, creating, building teams, and having fun. So it's going to have to offer something that your home doesn't. All right, I'm going to have to skip through a bit. So next, just flick through. I'll tell you when to stop. Just stop for a moment. Sorry, one back. So Television Centre is just down the road, and I think that is an interesting model for the future because it is truly mixed use. 400 homes, offices, a hotel, White City House Club, TV studios, retail, restaurants. So, and for that reason, it's almost like a slice of the West End in White City. And it's been very successful as a kind of core revitalisation for White City. So if you flick forward, and I'll tell you when to stop. Okay, please keep going. Yeah, so finishing off, lessons for the recovery of London post-pandemic. Next slide. So I think we have to remind ourselves that London has improved rather a lot as a livable place in the last 150 years. And while it can look a bit dystopian for those of you who have been into town recently, this is part of an ongoing transformation. So next slide. This has been through generally a series of innovations, and a couple were mentioned. So Howard mentioned Dockland's history. So containerization was a key innovation that led to places like Canary Wharf opening up and new waterside environments. Pat also mentioned her smoking or having ashtrays on the desk, and the smoking ban also I've got there as that helped with more outdoor seating, more pleasant indoor leisure environments. And it's possible that the pandemic means that we've got a couple of new innovations. So with flexible working, we could see the end of the rush hour. So there'll be less negative attitudes to traveling by tube. And also with flexible working, I think that we'll see more mixed use places, more dynamic, vibrant, appealing workplaces, and perhaps less kind of monocultural corporate monoliths that are a bit intimidating and not very welcoming. And that could improve the city urban character. Next slide. So just to finish off, and there's been a lot of talk about third space. So this graph just sets out that workplaces are a compromise between being close to home and being collaborative. And the office still has a role as being the preeminent place for creative possibilities and collaboration, whereas the home is obviously the most convenient. And then third spaces will increasingly carve out a niche as a compromise of the two. But any other spaces will have to compete and prove that they represent a convenience compromise between those two factors. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm sorry you had to skip over those slides because, they looked as though there was some fascinating information, but this presentation and along with the slides will be going out to people on the call. So they'll be able to look at these in more detail. What you're talking about there is sort of building, I mean, you've both been talking about building an ecology of place, and there's a symbiotic relationship between what you've talked about the improvements of our spaces and, not just over the past 150 years, but we've been really making a conscious effort over the past 15 or so years to make places for people. And that requires not only good developers and landowners, but it requires very good designers and thinkers about space as well. So that takes me nicely onto our last speaker, which is Yasmin Al-Ani Spence, who's the director at Wilkinson Air. Over to you, please, Yasmin. Thank you.
Hi, Pat. Thank you very much. Yes, following on from Howard and David, and I'll go back to sort of the title of this, how has work changed over the last 15 years. And if you want to go to the first slide, please. I mean, the first change is to do a reality check. I'm a director at Wilkinson Air. I've been there for 6 years, and I'm currently sitting in my son's room, who's gone back to university. My headsets are gaming headsets because that's what he uses. And I've got a 5-month-old puppy lying next to me that I hope doesn't bark. That is the current reality of working from home. And we're lucky, we have a house, we have a garden, we have enough space for everybody. Not everybody is in that situation. And this is something we also need to really discuss and account for when we talk about, how we're going to work from now on and what we're going to do, and we're all going to work from home. Like you said, Pat, earlier, not everybody works from an office in the first place, and not everybody has the comfort of being able to work from home for various reasons. So looking at the first slide, I started in architecture in London about 25 years ago, and actually the first office that I worked for pretty much looked like that. It wasn't bad. The destination of the office then was in Covent Garden, so that was the highlight. That was the amenities. You went to the gym, you went to the office, and actually what the office so much looked like inside didn't really matter because, well, you were in Covent Garden. We were tied to go to the office because of the technology. This is, I'm talking 25 years ago. Nobody had their own computer, and if they did, well, they were so slow, and you still remember you had to dial in and God knows what. So this has been for a long time. So when I started in architecture, we did something for German Valley back at the days and so on. It was speculative office, hopefully in a nice place, and that people can then go out. So the amenities were within the area of the office space. If we move on to slide 2, it's changed now. Technology that tied us down is now what lets us go. We can work from anywhere. I can work from the plane, I can work from the train, I can work from wherever I want to be. So I'm set free. This is what we've been enabled to do, and that is the true crux of this new freedom that we now have. So going to the next slide, number 3, that brings us exactly as sort of David was saying at the end, there's the third space. So I can be at home. I can be at home to pick up my child potentially, or do my yoga, whatever I need to do. I can find another space to work from, this third space. I was in the park the other day and somebody said they book for £10 a day the local pub, even during working hours, and they can sit there. So these are the third places. But if we create more and more of those, first of all, what happens to our offices? What happens to the identity of places that we work for? For some people, obviously, this suits really well. Startup businesses, young businesses, small business, that is perfect. But we are talking, especially sort of with you guys, we're talking about bigger office spaces. Do we need to create yet another space when we already have an office and when we already have a home? Something needs to change. We can't be so, especially in these days of sustainability, how sustainable is it to gather more and more spaces in order for us to work? So if we move to slide number 4, it's just a diagram, but it's saying what we love about the in-between spaces, these third spaces, is a bit of freedom. It is the collaboration, it is choice, it is destination. I can work in the coolest coffee shop in Shoreditch if I want to, although I might live somewhere completely different. And what we now need to do is that the offices that we have, they need to work harder to provide people that same feeling, also now the feeling of comfort, that they are in a healthy environment. This is something that we didn't touch about. We talk about servicing, we talk about fresh air. All of this now needs to be part of an office space, or is much more expected than it was 15 years ago. Nobody asked back then, how much fresh air is coming into the building. We need to allow for collaboration. We need to give people a workspace of a destination. And how do we do that? So if you go to slide number 5, please. So this is one of our projects, Brock Street, which is obviously in the heart of London. Which has this sort of external greening space, always programmed, very much of a sort of sunny day with events and seasonal. And this is again what draws people to work. They have these outside spaces as well as other ancillary spaces. And if we go to slide number 6, it was actually British Land who's just recently had this article about this new pavilion that they're putting in exactly that square outside the Brock Street, which is Facebook offices. And that is purely their Regent's Place, which has bars, which has those ancillary spaces that we were just talking about, that makes people feel like they are in the right destination. We touched about young people, David did, who prefer to work somewhere cool. When I started out, you worked somewhere, it didn't particularly have to be cool. So this is sort of British Land's attempt, and probably quite worthwhile, is to get people to draw back into their workplaces by saying, these are your offices, but your area here will also provide this. If you go to slide number 7, please. Slightly out of London, but very much on cue now, which I never thought sort of 6 years ago. When I joined Wilkinson Air, one of the first projects I worked on was a campus for Dyson. And the British Land pavilion that we were looking at just now says this is making a sort of local campus. So going to this slide, which is in Wiltshire, obviously nice greenery, they understood that word campus quite early on. They had only one building there, and they then decided, especially as they were a bit more remote, we need to offer people, especially because of this remoteness, exactly that excitement of well-being, interaction, culture, and that feeling that you're in a destination, and with it goes that feeling of identity that they're opened up. And so the next slide as well, there's another site very close by, which is another Dyson site, was all about creating healthy spaces, fresh air. And the next slide, slide number 9, again about collaboration. So they, and again, this completed about 3 years ago, when talking about all of these ancillary spaces wasn't quite even what it is now. So even in the last 5 years, the change has been really, really big. Working on these Dyson projects was the first time I ever had to work on oversubscription of seating, because it already allowed for people to work agile. Now oversubscription of seating is on everybody's terms, everybody's talking about it. Not everybody in your office will get their own seat anymore. And then going into creating this community, if we go to slide 10, it's one of our projects, which is Battersea, and it's taking exactly what Dyson did in small in a big format. It's the mixed use. Again, it's all about people feel when they come to work, they have that choice, they have a full day of things that they can do. They don't need to then leave the office and travel to the gym. They can do it right there. They can go and eat right there. They can meet their friends. They can read their book. So again, Battersea has that mixed use element, from housing to work. Apple is moving in to cinemas, to obviously a huge amount of retail and F&B offers, if you go to slide 11. And not only does that create a destination within the old building and an exciting space for those who work and live there, but it's also rejuvenating that area of Vauxhall, which, you know, I live fairly close to there, which has been sort of the forgotten bit for a very, very, very long time. And that's a very exciting prospect, and it moves people in as well. So that idea of the mixed element is really what we strive for, is to give people that choice. And if we go to slide 12, and I think Howard did obviously a bit on the Canary Wharf. I started my first project about 25 years ago, was actually in Canary Wharf, when Canary Wharf was still pretty much, I mean, I couldn't believe it. I went there and I thought, who will ever come here? There is nothing. Well, little did I know, and a lot of people did. And so currently we're working with a global investment bank in Canary Wharf on refurbishment of their building. And it's an interesting work. On Canary Wharf hasn't got, as we sort of say, the appeal of a Covent Garden or a Shoreditch or all of those, but it has now its own identity as well. And then how do you bring that back into a new refurbished building? And I think refurbishing and reusing our buildings are really, really key, especially if we do talk going back a step into the third part, into the third uses or third spaces. So within this building, we don't have the opportunity to grow out and get fat. So we're creating communities within the building. So all the floors have, not all the floors, but every chunk of 3 floors is put together with villages. These villages have different opportunities. They've got cafes, they've got meeting spaces, so that you still have that same feel, that you can still work somewhere else. You're not tied to your desk. You can do your focused work at one part, and you can do a more collaborative work one part. We've taken on board the COVID essence of it and given everything that bit more space, a lot more space than we would have done 15 years ago. And talking, so that's a big shift in how to make that building interesting for the people. Not that the company says we don't want them to leave the building at lunchtime, but that they are enabled, that they can stay and have the right environment around them if they do wish. So we have wellness, we have sports, we have connectivity, and we have a lot of landscaping and biophilia, all to give people the destination and that cultural changes as well. Similar project we've just sort of completed on a different scale, which is Gresham St. Paul's. Again, it's the rejuvenating existing building and making our older building working harder for us now. And especially in this time after the pandemic, this is really important. It is about global, sustainability. It is about circular economy. We can't just be relentless and build new again and again. We need to make our buildings work harder. And also within the amount of people that we have in the buildings, how do they work smarter? But that is a sort of another discussion. Now, quickly sort of running through, because I'm aware of time, we talked about all these things, what makes a good office, what gets people back in the office. Basically, this is all about how do we get people back to the office? We have to provide a safe space. So this is 14 now, slide 14. We have to give them spaces they can, sorry, this was the Gresham St. Paul's I just spoke about. If you go to the next slide, please, Molly. We've got, you know, greening is and well-being is on the top of the agenda of every developer, of every owner, of any office manager. It is there, and learning more again throughout pandemic how absolutely useful these green spaces and wellness is, and how we suffer without them. And the first example of that is, you know, the minute the sunshine comes out, we're all in the garden. This is the only thing we can really do. If you go to now 15, please. Again, our buildings can do more than they used to do. Like I said, when I worked on my first office building in Soho, there was no talk of a gym or a yoga class. I mean, I think if anybody would have mentioned, people would have laughed. And now this is nearly, especially for the bigger corporations, a must, because it's also about gaining and retaining talent. This is a mantra that goes on and on and on, and that's fair enough. You need to treat your staff well, and you need to now be an exemplar in order to gain staff as well. And this is one way of doing it. And it's a wonderful full circle. The staff gets the benefit out of it, and then the employer gets the benefit out of it. We talk about 16, end of journey, a lot more. Please, next slide, Molly. You know, how do we get to our destinations? It's, you know, in a healthy way. Now our buildings, for the building in Canary Wharf, we're supplying up to 600 cycle racks. I will never cycle anywhere, but hey ho, a lot of people do, and that's right. And yeah, so slide 17, I'll just wrap it up now, is one thing that keeps, exactly, thank you, that's even better, is to just say, how do we put all of that together? We need to treat our buildings well, they need to treat us well, and we need to make sure that stepping forward into this new world of going back to work, we do this correctly, and we do it with time, and we don't have knee-jerk reactions of over-designing or ignoring things just because we feel this is the moment to do it. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. There's a lot there in your presentation and the other presentations we heard. And I'm sorry we've had to rush you, all of you, because there's a lot that you want to impart and need to impart in this. There's some fascinating things there, and there are also some interesting contradictions as well. You talked about talent, and we heard right at the get-go from Howard about how the occupier was the person that came from the occupier, the idea of Canary Wharf, and listening to the occupier is absolutely critical. And so much of what we have done over the past however many years is to make sure that London and other urban centres, commercial urban centres, are places that people want to live and work in. But David, we also heard from you about culture and the importance of culture. Yet my heckles rose when I heard that you say that mementos and sort of knickknacks and things like that, my terminology, not yours, were there. And I was reflecting as we were talking that, so much of what has driven the change in the look and feel over the past, I would say, 15 plus years, the NLA period, has been the rise of the creative sector, and the way the tea building and what that sort of energized in and sparked in Shoreditch, and the creative industries being really principal occupiers, and the way the sector has responded to that. And is there a contradiction between sort of what we were hearing about the importance of well-being and the importance of that experience, but actually having places where you can't have your own desk, and how do we square that circle? Maybe it's my personal prejudice and I shut up, but David, can you kick off on that, please?
I think it's a very good point. I think there's a tension, isn't there? You not having your space to land in, but the trade for that is freedom. Freedom you know, whether freedom not to pack into a crush tube at 7:30 in the morning, to actually do, you know, some work at home and then go in when it suits, and when, you know, when it's productive to do so. So personally, I think trading the, you know, gonk and calendar on your desk, which is, you know, sort of putting down roots in that stationary drawer that you've not sorted out in 5 years. I think that's kind of worth it for the life enhancing freedom that is the trade. But I agree that one of the downsides of the new flexibility is the kind of always on culture, and that is having an impact on people's well-being, and it takes adjustment and management.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions brewing. So what I'd really love is 30-second answers from Howard and Yasmin to that point, please, and then we'll move on for quick fire questions. Howard.
I think the important thing here is that there's no one right answer. Some people really like having their own desk. Some people really like having their own office within the office. And that's fine. If that's what works for you, that's fantastic. And I do know at least one firm, but remain nameless, who went to an entirely hot desk and then found that people were really fighting over, you know, I want to own this space. I want to be here every day. I want a bit of, you know, the sort of completely anchorless existence really disturbs some people. Yeah. And others, you know, absolutely thrive in sitting on a sofa with a laptop. Okay. So I think there's a danger here that we sort of impose a particular view on, you know, how it should be, when actually having the options and the flexibility to maybe have, yeah, permanent office, permanent desk, hot desk, third space as part of the mix is where we want to go, rather than, you know, trying to impose it on people.
Thank you very much. Yasmin.
I think the idea is that one shoe simply does not fit all. We're going to have to come up with spaces that will please most people. We can't just go one way or another. It's finding that medium, that soft spot where everybody is happy. Some people need to be at their desks for various reasons, some people not. And we just need to spend that little time to find the options and the choices.
It's that time, isn't it? It's taking the time to do that. It's really important. Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions. I'm going to be selective of who I go for, and if you're desperate to answer, then just do say. Somebody wants to know, an anonymous attendee, what other areas of business districts do you see emerging after the pandemic? I'll take that to you, Howard.
One of the great things, and again, lesson from history for us, I mean, we were created because the city in particular wasn't creating the sort of space that people wanted. Since Canary Wharf started, and obviously we're only half finished, so, you know, we are still going to be a massive growth player in the future. But since Canary Wharf started, there have been loads of competition, effectively. Really great spaces. I mean, King's Cross is great. London Bridge City is great. White City, you know, Earl's Court coming up, Battersea. There are some really fantastic new places in London coming, and that is brilliant because what it offers is competition, and it means that when somebody chooses to locate in London, they've got a multiplicity of different places they can go. It's about making the cake bigger for everybody. And bringing in businesses that, you know, maybe they don't want to go in the city, maybe they want to go to Canary Wharf, but Battersea's great for them. For us, bringing in a whole new sector, which we're going to talk about a bit later in the year, is going to be very exciting. I think it's good. In the future, who knows? I mean, I've been keeping an eye on Euston and north of Euston for a little while. I think there's a lot of potential growth around North London there. But of course, you know, like I said, we're only half finished at Canary Wharf.
Great, thanks very much. Affordable workspace, how are we going to make that more of a priority in the next 15 years? Yasmin and David, quick answers to that, please.
I mean, I would go back to go for affordable workspaces. Like I said, we have buildings that are not working hard enough as they're can be. We've got high streets where we have continuous empty shops, and I think it's looking to what we've got. Okay,
thank you, David. Thanks.
Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities, as Yasmin said, from the disruption that high streets are experiencing. Also, that people may want to work in their local centre and establish business connections where they live rather than in the centre of town. But I think just finally, I think affordable workspace policies are emerging, and they are positive. They hit the zeitgeist because I think there's a recognition that SMEs are an important part of workplace ecosystems.
It relates to a question that's been tabled by David Clausen, and if you accept that it's the commuting people don't want, and working from home is probably not a good idea in the long term. Our local out of London work multi-company workspaces part of the answer, who would promote and fund it. If I may, I'd just like to take chair's privilege and say I think some of the points that you two have just answered is part of the solution there. And then just one final point which is a point, not a question, which I think we're going to give the last word almost to John Burton on this. John Burton from Trinity Boy Wharf and all sorts of other things. Really interesting about Chiswick Park. I did all the local consultation for Stanhope in the late 1980s. I didn't know you were that old, John. And the then site had just finished being a bus manufactory. Most interesting to me was that it was a whole social hub too, with bowling green, social club and dance hall for the workers and their families only. As in so much, there are plenty of lessons from history. That was a bus manufactory. And I think that's what we're going back to, isn't it? We're returning to these places as being multifunctioning. And I think my final word is just going back to this notion of talent and the mixity that we've heard about, and the lessons that we have to work through and resolve this pandemic, as our workplaces have given given society a whole different sort of street scene and built environment where we've all benefited from that clustering of people to work, whether it's in Canary Wharf. I shop in Canary Wharf at the weekend, and it's a great place to go shopping, and you see families, people of all ages there for the amenities that are there. Some of those sprung up principally to serve the workforce, but by actually creating an agglomeration of workplaces and a workforce, you bring in other facilities, whether it's shoe repairers or dry cleaners, and a host of amenities, and we all benefit from those. And if therefore we'll all be sadder, I think, if this pandemic actually does reduce the role of the sort of the commercial workspace within our urban centres. We've talked exclusively about London today. This is a trend that's going on across the world as well. So I'm a minute over, and I know that we have to wrap up. I'm sorry we didn't get a lot of time for your questions, and we could have pulled out all sorts of points, but we've got three very, very talented and experienced people on the panel, and you heard a lot from them, and there's even more in their slides that we'll send round. So I would like to say thank you to the audience, and a special thank you to our wonderful panel, and thank you to NLA, and happy 15th birthday, and here's to the next 15 years. Thank you, everybody.